Let's take a few more questions. We have a question over here. Would someone like to ask a question?
This is kind of a loaded question. I guess I'm trying to put myself in someone else's shoes and listening to what you guys are saying. A lot of good and helpful things, but I was wondering if you guys could define and help us understand what is privilege, and then how do I move past the guilt of having it?
I can start. There's a book called The Hidden Cost of Being African American. There's a nice scholarly accounting of this idea of privilege. For example, although I have 4 post-secondary degrees, if I was white and had that many degrees, I would not have to, I could afford more of a house on the far south side of Chicago. So although I have the privilege of an education, many of the peers of mine, they don't have to have as much education as I do. But here's another privilege I have. I'm tall, I'm a male, I speak well, I wear glasses, I wear my pants on my waist with a belt, I say yes, thank you, please, no. So I have privileges there as a male too. There's an incident that happened where one of my colleagues, when I was an assistant principal, she was really upset. And in that moment, my principal and I were both black males, and we were talking to a black female. So it's all black folks, but I also recognized the gender privilege that we as black men had also in authority. And I thought wow, she's really looking for empathy, but we are missing something here. And I know we are. So I slipped them a note, and on it had 2 words, Anita Hill. So the issue was not a sexual issue at all. But when Anita Hill was in front of that Judiciary Committee talking about Clarence Thomas, none of the men understood what she was saying. They just did not understand, because they have been in the locker rooms with each other. They have been at the bars with each other. They have been in the showers with each other. And although this is a black woman talking about a black man, the men were like, I don't get it. It's not that big of an issue. The Judiciary Committee added 1 woman after that. I don't know if there's more than 1 on there now. But I think everybody occupies some type of privilege, and I can only speak from where I sit. Yesterday or Wednesday, I got pulled over by the police. And it's happened now twice. I've gotten off on warnings. The last 2 times I've been pulled over, I think there's a conspiracy to catch one and let them go so they can tell the good news. Maybe, there's a quota. Catch one, let him go. Make sure he has a bow tie on and has some nice glasses.
Maybe he'll be on a forum and he'll
be on a forum and they'll tell the good story.
He looks like he's headed to a forum.
But that's my thought.
I mean, a part of your question was also about the guilt, I think, is what you brought up. And I will let others talk about sort of how to reconcile that. But, I grew up always, at least hearing from my family and church community, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think what I've realized over time in terms of the privilege that basically my parents owning a business in a neighborhood that got better, then started to afford us, was to never ever forget sort of our starting place in life, and never ever ever think that just because my parents happened to buy a building in a neighborhood that significantly gentrified, that we were any better than anybody else who was living in that community, actually right across the street from King High School, and the other communities in which we lived. And so one of the things that I think I've realized over time, as an African American person, as a woman, but also someone who has also seen different parts of the economic sort of spectrum of our country, is how there are good and awesome people truly everywhere. And it's more about what you decide to do with whatever set of privilege you have to ensure that you're opening up the doors of opportunity for others. So for example, at Teach for America, when Jeremy talked about sort of where I ended up, I never think of myself as ending up there. So it was really interesting even for me to hear him say sort of where I ended up, because I'm like, that's not how I really thought about myself. I just tried to go in, do really great work, and then when it became very, very, very obvious to me that I could play a significant role, given the roles that I was in, to help diversify the organization, I decided that that's what I should really also dive into, including having very tough conversations with people who were more senior to me, who were often white, about how they also needed to evolve the way that they were thinking and systematically doing things. And that actually, at one point in time, almost cost me my job. But ultimately, I had to step out on faith and do what I really, really believe was genuinely right, because I believe that the doors of opportunity really should be open to everyone. And so whenever I've been in a moment where it was very clear to me that I did have an additional set of privilege to someone else, the question I'm always asking myself is, what should I do to ensure that I'm opening the doors of opportunity for other people?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think the more you delve into these topics and learn about these things, the issue of white privilege is something that we must become more comfortable talking about. It's an awkward thing, but I think it's incredibly important. And I know that in my own life, the primary way for me to do that has been, first of all, by just learning. There's a lot of history behind it. There's a lot of current day context, many of which Michael was alluding to in his list of studies, that bear out from our history. So I think we need to be able to say this openly, that this is a reality. And the funny thing about me recommending Michael's book to white people is that I know that if it were written by a black guy, you probably, as a white person, would have it, you wouldn't believe it. So he carries a privilege in writing that book to start the conversation, to help you become aware of it. I do this not through writing, but through speaking. I know, in fact, it was a Korean friend of mine who handed me Michael's book originally, and he said, "You need to read this and tell our church about it, because if I tell them, I'm complaining." So he was, in effect, asking me to use my privilege of being able to be listened to in the interest of the conversation. And then the next book that I tell my white friends to read after you finish Michael's book is Ed Gilbreth's book, Reconciliation Blues. Similar subject from an African-American perspective. You can't just hear from a white person. So I think becoming aware of it is absolutely critical. And then on the topic of guilt, I would just say this. If it doesn't stir up a level of guilt, I don't think you're paying attention. And yet, guilt is not a Christian motivation. At the end of the day, the motivation for us to deal with these things is not guilt. And so it's difficult.
Michael.
Yeah, I see we have someone else waiting to ask a question. I'll be very brief. To me, privilege is advantage. And I think there's two things, if you're white, that you should think about doing with that. One is giving it up. And two, as we've been talking about, is that you must use it for others in a sacrificial way. So I always just look at, what did Jesus do? He gave up absolute perfection for this world, right? He didn't have to, but he did it. There's something there about that in sacrifice, again, the beauty of God really shines through. And so I'll just finish with this on this question. We have a professor where I now work, North Park University, Soong-Chan Rah, who has just published a book called Lament. And if he were here, what he would say is, there are, and this is true, there are literally tens of millions of dead bodies strewn throughout our history, and we hear about more every day because of this thing called race. And if we don't first do what is the biblical message, to lament, to just stop and pour out like we are at a funeral, we won't be able to move forward. We can't pretend the dead bodies aren't there.
Last question. Thanks for waiting.
May I turn it to Sue? It's important. Okay. Thank you. I've been 28 years in Detroit, and then West Side, South Side, and so I'm coming up here, and I'm Gina, and I'm coming up here so with a little bit of battle fatigue, perhaps. And so I have two questions related to the school. One is just structural. And as soon as you start thinking about funding a school, you're thinking about carrying on certain kinds of conversations, and you put yourself in a position of dependency to the racially isolated white suburbanite who has access to resources. But to carry on that conversation favorably, it's one kind of conversation. To really care about structures and systems and tell truth about those things, you have to carry on a different kind of conversation. So my first question is, how are you thinking about navigating that, without jeopardizing the project, right?
Can I take the microphone? They probably don't know because I asked them to come on the panel, not to start the school. I'll speak very briefly after this a little bit about sort of the vision for the school. You want to ask the second question, though?
The second question is also school-related.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And this ties into the ideas of beauty and the images that we have coming back to us that sort of normalize certain things and then marginalize other things. It seems to me that kids have a greater capacity and sense of power related to structural phenomena that are telling them lies about themselves, even all of the images that are in their own neighborhoods, once they can name them. And so my other curricular question would be, how are you thinking about curriculum? So classical model, but simultaneously almost critical race theory. How do you intend to do both so that the students are best served?
Great question. Great question. Can I ask that we give our panelists a round of applause?